Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish from 1666, considered to be the first science fiction book written by a woman. It's a fascinating glimpse into the ideas of science and philosophy at that time. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 5, Episode 87. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you have a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, it helps more than you know. You can also hear our episodes on YouTube. If you are listening there, please like our episodes and leave a comment for us. We love hearing from you. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. No sooner was the lady brought before the emperor, but he conceived her to be some goddess, and offered to worship her, which she refused, telling him, for by that time she had pretty well learned their language, that although she came out of another world, yet was she but a mortal. At which the emperor, rejoicing, made her his wife, and gave her an absolute power to rule and govern all that world as she pleased. But her subjects, who could hardly be persuaded to believe her mortal, tended her all the veneration and worship due to a deity. Her accoutrement, after she was made empress, was as followeth. On her head she wore a cap of pearl, and a half-moon of diamonds just before it. On the top of her crown came spreading over a broad carbuncle, cut in the form of the sun. Her coat was of pearl mixed with blue diamonds and fringed with red ones. Her buskins and sandals were of green diamonds. In her left hand she held a buckler to signify the defense of her dominions, which buckler was made of that sort of diamond as has several different colors, and being cut and made in the form of an arch, showed like a rainbow. In her right hand she carried a spear made of white diamond, cut like the tail of a blazing star, which signified that she was ready to assault those that proved her enemies. None was allowed to use or wear gold but those of the imperial race, which were the only nobles of the state. Nor durst anyone wear jewels but the emperor, the empress, and their eldest son, notwithstanding that they had an infinite quantity both of gold and precious stones in that world. For they had larger extents of gold than our Arabian sands. Their precious stones were rocks, and their diamonds of several colors. They used no coin, but all their traffic was by exchange of several commodities. Their priests and governors were princes of the imperial blood, and made eunuchs for that purpose. And as for the ordinary sort of men in that part of the world where the emperor resided, They were of several complexions, not white, black, tawny, olive, or ash-colored, but some appeared of an azure, some of a deep purple, some of a grass green, some of a scarlet, some of an orange color, etc., which colors and complexions, whether they were made by the bare reflection of light without the assistance of small particles, or by the help of well-ranged and ordered atoms, or by a continual agitation of little globules, or by some pressing and reacting motion, I am not able to determine. The rest of the inhabitants of that world were men of several different sorts, shapes, figures, dispositions, and humours, as I have already made mention heretofore. Some were bear men, some worm men, some fish or mermen, otherwise called sirens, some bird men, some fly men, some ant men, some geese men, some spider men, some lice men, some fox men, some ape men, some jackdaw men, some magpie men, some parrot men, some satyrs, some giants, and many more which I cannot all remember. And of these several sorts of men, each followed such a profession as was most proper for the nature of their species, which the Empress encouraged them in, especially those that had applied themselves to the study of several arts and sciences, for they were as ingenious and witty in the invention of profitable and useful arts as we are in our world, nay, more. And to that end she erected schools, and founded several societies. The bear men were to be her experimental philosophers, the bird men her astronomers, the fly, worm, and fish men her natural philosophers, the ape men her chemists, the satyrs her Galenic physicians, the foxmen her politicians, the spider and lice men her mathematicians, the jackdaw, magpie, and parrot men her orators and logicians, the giants her architects, etc. But before all things, she having got a sovereign power from the emperor over all the world, desired to be informed both of the manner of their religion and government. And to that end she called the priests and statesmen to give her an account of either. Of the statesmen she enquired first why they had so few laws, to which they answered that many laws made many divisions, which most commonly did breed factions, and at last broke out into open wars. Next she asked why they preferred the monarchical form of government before any other. They answered that as it was natural for one body to have but one head, so it was also natural for a politic body to have but one governor, and that a commonwealth, which had many governors, was like a monster with many heads. Besides, said they, a monarchy is a divine form of government, and agrees most with our religion. For as there is but one God, whom we all unanimously worship and adore with one faith, so we are resolved to have but one emperor, to whom we all submit with one obedience. Then the Empress, seeing that the several sorts of her subjects had each their churches apart, asked the priests whether they were of several religions. They answered her Majesty that there was no more but one religion in all that world, nor no diversity of opinions in that same religion. For though there were several sorts of men, yet had they all but one opinion concerning the worship and adoration of God. The Empress asked them whether they were Jews, Turks, or Christians. "We do not know," said they, "what religions those are, but we do all unanimously acknowledge, worship, and adore the only omnipotent and eternal God, with all reverence, submission, and duty." Again the Empress inquired whether they had several forms of worship. They answered, "No, for our devotion and worship consists only in prayers, which we frame according to our several necessities, in petitions, humiliations, thanksgiving, etc." "Truly," replied the Empress, "I thought you had been either Jews or Turks, because I never perceived any women in your congregations. But what is the reason you bar them from your religious assemblies?" "It is not fit," said they, "that men and women should be promiscuously together in time of religious worship. For their company hinders devotion, and makes many, instead of praying to God, direct their devotion to their mistresses." "But," asked the Empress, "have they no congregation of their own, to perform the duties of divine worship as well as men?" "No," answered they, "but they stay at home, and say their prayers by themselves in their closets." Then the Empress desired to know the reason why the priests and governors of their world were made eunuchs. They answered, "To keep them from marriage, for women and children most commonly make disturbance both in church and state." "But," said she, "women and children have no employment in church or state." "'Tis true," answered they, "but although they are not admitted to public employments, yet they are so prevalent with their husbands and parents that many times, by their importunate persuasions, they cause as much, nay, more mischief secretly than if they had the management of public affairs." The Empress, having received an information of what concerned both church and state, passed some time in viewing the imperial palace, where she admired much the skill and ingenuity of the architects, and enquired of them first why they built their houses no higher than 2 stories from the ground. They answered Her Majesty that the lower their buildings were, the less were they subject either to the heat of the sun or wind, tempest, decay, etc. Then she desired to know the reason why they made them so thick. They answered that the thicker the walls were, the warmer they were in winter, the cooler in summer, for their thickness kept out both the cold and heat. Lastly, she asked why they arched their roofs, and made so many pillars. They replied that arches and pillars did not only grace a building very much, and caused it to appear magnificent, but made it also firm and lasting. The Empress was very well satisfied with their answers, and after some time, when she thought that her new-founded societies of the virtuosos had made a good progress in the several employments she had put them upon, she caused a convocation first of the birdmen, and commanded them to give her a true relation of the 2 celestial bodies, viz., the sun and moon, which they did with all the obedience and faithfulness befitting their duty. The sun, as much as they could observe, they related to be a firm or solid stone, of a vast bigness, of color yellowish, and of an extraordinary splendor. But the moon, they said, was of a whitish color, and although she looked dim in the presence of the sun, yet she had her own light, and was a shining body of herself, as might be perceived by her vigorous appearance in moonshiny nights. The difference only betwixt her own and the sun's light was, that the sun did strike his beams in a direct line, but the moon never respected the centre of their world in a right line, but her centre was always eccentrical. The spots both in the sun and moon, as far as they were able to perceive, they affirmed to be nothing else but flaws and stains of their stony bodies. Concerning the heat of the sun, they were not of one opinion. Some would have the sun hot in itself, alleging an old tradition, that it should at some time break asunder, and burn the heavens, and consume this world into hot embers, which, said they, could not be done if the sun were not fiery of itself. Others again said, this opinion could not stand with reason, for fire being a destroyer of all things, the sun's stone after this manner would burn up all the near adjoining bodies. Besides, said they, fire cannot subsist without fuel, and the sunstone, having nothing to feed on, would in a short time consume itself, wherefore they thought it more probable that the sun was not actually hot, but only by the reflection of its light, so that its heat was an effect of its light, both being immaterial. But this opinion again was laughed at by others, and rejected as ridiculous, who thought it impossible that one immaterial should produce another, and believed that both the light and heat of the sun proceeded from a swift circular motion of the ethereal globules, which by their striking upon the optic nerve caused light, and their motion produced heat. But neither would this opinion hold, for, said some, then it would follow that the sight of animals is the cause of light, and that, were there no eyes, there would be no light, which was against all sense and reason. Thus they argued concerning the heat and light of the sun, but, which is remarkable, none did say that the sun was a globous fluid body, and had a swift circular motion, but all agreed it was fixed and firm like a centre, and therefore they generally called it the sunstone. Then the empress asked them the reason why the sun and moon did often appear in different postures or shapes, as sometimes magnified, sometimes diminished, sometimes elevated, otherwhiles depressed, now thrown to the right, and then to the left. To which some of the birdmen answered, that it proceeded from the various degrees of heat and cold which are found in the air, from whence did follow a differing density and rarity, and likewise from the vapours that are interposed, whereof those that ascend are higher and less dense than the ambient air, but those which descend are heavier and more dense. But others did with more probability affirm that it was nothing else but the various patterns of the air. For like as painters do not copy out one and the same original just alike at all times, so, said they, do several parts of the air make different patterns of the luminous bodies of the sun and moon, which patterns, as several copies, the sensitive motions do figure out in the substance of our eyes. This answer the Empress liked much better than the former, and enquired further what opinion they had of those creatures that are called the motes of the sun. To which they answered that they were nothing else but streams of very small, rare, and transparent particles, through which the sun was represented as through a glass. For if they were not transparent, said they would eclipse the light of the sun, and if not rare and of an airy substance, they would hinder flies from flying in the air, or at least retard their flying motion. Nevertheless, although they were thinner than the thinnest vapor, yet were they not so thin as the body of air, or else they would not be perceptible by animal sight. Then the Empress asked whether they were living creatures. They answered yes, because they did increase and decrease, and were nourished by the presence and starved by the absence of the sun. Having thus finished their discourse of the sun and moon, the Empress desired to know what stars there were besides. But they answered that they could perceive in that world none other but blazing stars, and from thence it had the name that it was called the blazing world. And these blazing stars, said they, were such solid, firm, and shining bodies as the sun and moon, not of a globular, but of several sorts of figures. Some had tails, and some other kinds of shapes. After this, the Empress asked them what kind of substance or creature the air was. The birdmen answered that they could have no other perception of the air but by their own respiration. For, said they, some bodies are only subject to touch, others only to sight, and others only to smell. But some are subject to none of our exterior senses. For nature is so full of variety that our weak senses cannot perceive all the various sorts of her creatures. Neither is there any one object perceptible by all our senses, no more than several objects are by one sense. I believe you, replied the Empress, but if you can give no account of the air, said she, you will hardly be able to inform me how wind is made, for they say that wind is nothing but motion of the air. The birdmen answered that they observed wind to be more dense than air, and therefore subject to the sense of touch. But what properly wind was, and the manner how it was made, they could not exactly tell. Some said it was caused by the clouds falling on each other, and others that it was produced of a hot and dry exhalation, which, ascending, was driven down again by the coldness of the air that is in the middle region, and by reason of its lightness could not go directly to the bottom, but was carried by the air up and down. Some would have it a flowing water of the air, and others again a flowing air moved by the blaze of the stars. But the Empress, seeing they could not agree concerning the cause of wind, asked whether they could tell how snow was made. To which they answered that according to their observation, snow was made by a commixture of water and some certain extract of the element of fire that is under the moon, a small portion of which extract, being mixed with water and beaten by air or wind, made a white froth called snow. which being after some while dissolved by the heat of the same spirit, turned to water again. This observation amazed the Empress very much, for she had hitherto believed that snow was made by cold motions, and not by such an agitation or beating of a fiery extract upon water. Nor could she be persuaded to believe it until the fish or mermen had delivered their observation upon the making of ice, which, they said, was not produced, as some hitherto conceived, by the motion of the air raking the superficies of the earth, but by some strong saline vapour arising out of the seas, which condensed water into ice. And the more quantity there was of that vapour, the greater were the mountains of precipices of ice. But the reason that it did not so much freeze in the torrid zone, or under the ecliptic, as near or under the poles, was that this vapour in those places, being drawn up by the sunbeams into the middle region of the air, was only condensed into water, and fell down in showers of rain. Whenas under the poles, the heat of the sun being not so vehement, the same vapour had no force or power to rise so high, and therefore caused so much ice by ascending and acting only upon the surface of water. This relation confirmed partly the observation of the birdmen concerning the cause of snow. But since they had made mention that that same extract, which by its commixture with water made snow, proceeded from the element of fire, that is under the moon, the Empress asked them of what nature that elementary fire was, whether it was like ordinary fire here upon earth, or such a fire as is within the bowels of the earth, and as the famous mountains Vesuvius and Etna do burn withal, or whether it was such a sort of fire as is found in flints, etc. They answered that the elementary fire, which is underneath the sun, was not so solid as any of those mentioned fires, because it had no solid fuel to feed on. But yet it was much like the flame of ordinary fire, only somewhat more thin and fluid. For flame, said they, is nothing else but the airy part of a fired body. Lastly, the Empress asked the birdmen of the nature of thunder and lightning, and whether it was not caused by roves of ice falling upon each other. To which they answered that it was not made that way, but by an encounter of cold and heat, so that an exhalation being kindled in the clouds did dash forth lightning, and that there were so many rentings of clouds as there were sounds and cracking noises. But this opinion was contradicted by others, who affirmed that thunder was a sudden and monstrous blaze stirred up in the air, and did not always require a cloud. But the Empress, not knowing what they meant by blaze, for even they themselves were not able to explain the sense of this word, liked the former better, and, to avoid hereafter tedious disputes, and have the truth of the phenomena of celestial bodies more exactly known, commanded the bearmen, which were her experimental philosophers, to observe them through such instruments as are called telescopes, which they did according to her Majesty's command. But these telescopes caused more differences and divisions amongst them than ever they had before. For some said, they perceived that the sun stood still, and the earth did move about it. Others were of opinion that they both did move, and others said again that the earth stood still and sun did move. Some counted more stars than others. Some discovered new stars never seen before. Some fell into a great dispute with others concerning the bigness of the stars. Some said the moon was another world like their terrestrial globe, and the spots therein were hills and valleys. But others would have the spots to be the terrestrial parts, and the smooth and glossy parts the sea. At last the Empress commanded them to go with their telescopes to the very end of the pole that was joined to the world she came from, and try whether they could perceive any stars in it, which they did, and, being returned to Her Majesty, reported that they had seen 3 blazing stars appear there, one after another in a short time, whereof 2 were bright and 1 dim. But they could not agree neither in this observation, for some said it was but 1 star which appeared at 3 several times in several places, and others would have them to be 3 several stars, for they thought it impossible that those 3 several appearances should have been but 1 star, because every star did rise at a certain time, and appeared in a certain place, and did disappear in the same place. Next, it is altogether improbable, said they, that 1 star should fly from place to place, especially at such a vast distance, without a visible motion in so short a time, and appear in such different places, whereof 2 were quite opposite, and the 3rd sideways. Lastly, if it had been but 1 star, said they, it would always have kept the same splendor, which it did not, for, as above mentioned, 2 were bright, and 1 was dim. After they had thus argued, the Empress began to grow angry at their telescopes that they could give no better intelligence. For, said she, now I do plainly perceive that your glasses are false informers, and instead of discovering the truth, delude your senses. Wherefore I command you to break them, and let the birdmen trust only to their natural eyes, and examine celestial objects by the motions of their own sense and reason. The bear men replied that it was not the fault of their glasses which caused such differences in their opinions, but the sensitive motions in their optic organs did not move alike, nor were their rational judgments always regular. To which the Empress answered that if their glasses were true informers, they would rectify their irregular sense and reason. But, said she, nature has made your sense and reason more regular than art has your glasses, for they are mere deluders and will never lead you to the knowledge of truth. Wherefore I command you again to break them. For you may observe the progressive motions of celestial bodies with your natural eyes better than through artificial glasses. The bear men, being exceedingly troubled at Her Majesty's displeasure concerning their telescopes, kneeled down, and in the humblest manner petitioned that they might not be broken. For, said they, we take more delight in artificial delusions than in natural truths. Besides, we shall want employments for our senses, and subjects for arguments, for were there nothing but truth, and no falsehood, there would be no occasion to dispute. And by this means we should want the aim and pleasure of our endeavors in confuting and contradicting each other. Neither would one man be thought wiser than another, but all would either be alike knowing and wise, or all would be fools. Wherefore we most humbly beseech your imperial majesty to spare our glasses, which are our only delight, and as dear to us as our lives. The Empress at last consented to their request, but upon condition that their disputes and quarrels should remain within their schools and cause no factions or disturbances in state or government. The bear men, full of joy, returned their most humble thanks to the Empress, and to make her amends for the displeasure which their telescopes had occasioned, told Her Majesty that they had several other artificial optic glasses which they were sure would give Her Majesty a great deal more satisfaction. Amongst the rest, they brought forth several microscopes, by the means of which they could enlarge the shapes of little bodies, and make a louse appear as big as an elephant, and a mite as big as a whale. First of all they showed the Empress a grey drone-fly, wherein they observed that the greatest part of her face, nay, of her head, consisted of two large bunches all covered over with a multitude of small pearls or hemispheres in a trigonal order, which pearls were of 2 degrees, smaller and bigger. The smaller degree was lowermost and looked towards the ground. The other was upward and looked sideward, forward, and backward. They were all so smooth and polished that they were able to represent the image of any object. The number of them was in all 14,000. After the view of this strange and miraculous creature, and their several observations upon it, the Empress asked them what they judged those little hemispheres might be. They answered that each of them was a perfect eye, by reason they perceived that each was covered with a transparent cornea, containing a liquor within them, which resembled the watery or glassy humour of the eye. To which the Empress replied that they might be glassy pearls, and yet not eyes, and that perhaps their microscopes did not truly inform them. But they smilingly answered Her Majesty that she did not know the virtue of those microscopes, for they never delude, but rectify and inform the senses, nay, the world, said they, would be but blind without them, as it has been in former ages before those microscopes were invented. After this they took a charcoal, and viewing it with one of their best microscopes, discovered in it an infinite multitude of pores, some bigger, some less, so close and thick that they left but very little space betwixt them to be filled with a solid body. And to give Her Imperial Majesty a better assurance thereof, they counted in a line of them an inch long, no less than 2,700 pores. From which observation they drew this following conclusion, to wit, that this multitude of pores was the cause of the blackness of the coal. For, said they, a body that has so many pores, from each of which no light is reflected, must necessarily look black, since black is nothing else but a privation of light, or a want of reflection. But the Empress replied that if all colors were made by reflection of light, and that black was as much a color as any other color, then certainly they contradicted themselves in saying that black was made by want of reflection. However, not to interrupt your microscopical inspections," said she, "let us see how vegetables appear through your glasses." Whereupon they took a nettle, and by the virtue of the microscope discovered that underneath the points of the nettle there were certain little bags or bladders containing a poisonous liquor, and when the points had made way into the interior parts of the skin, they, like syringe pipes, served to convey that same liquor into them. To which observation the Empress replied, that if there were such poison in nettles, then certainly in eating of them they would hurt us inwardly as much as they do outwardly. But they answered that it belonged to physicians more than to experimental philosophers to give reasons hereof, for they only made microscopical inspections, and related the figures of the natural parts of creatures according to the representation of their glasses. Lastly, they showed the Empress a flea and a louse, which creatures through the microscope appeared so terrible to her sight that they had almost put her into a swoon. The description of all their parts would be very tedious to relate, and therefore I'll forbear it at this present. The Empress, after the view of those strangely shaped creatures, pitied much those that are molested with them, especially poor beggars, which, although they have nothing to live on themselves, are yet necessitated to maintain and feed of their own flesh and blood a company of such terrible creatures called lice, who, instead of thanks, do reward them with pains, and torment them for giving them nourishment and food. But after the Empress had seen the shapes of these monstrous creatures, she desired to know whether their microscopes could hinder their biting, or at least show some means how to avoid them. To which they answered that such arts were mechanical and below the noble study of microscopical observations. Then the Empress asked them whether they had not such sorts of glasses that could enlarge and magnify the shapes of great bodies as well as they had done of little ones. Whereupon they took one of their best and largest microscopes and endeavored to view a whale through it. But alas, the shape of the whale was so big that its circumference went beyond the magnifying quality of the glass. Whether the error proceeded from the glass, or from a wrong position of the whale against the reflection of light, I cannot certainly tell. The Empress, seeing the insufficiency of those magnifying glasses, that they were not able to enlarge all sorts of objects, asked the bear men whether they could not make glasses of a contrary nature to those they had showed her. To wit, such as instead of enlarging or magnifying the shape or figure of an object, could contract it beneath its natural proportion, which, in obedience to her Majesty's commands, they did, and viewing through one of the best of them, a huge and mighty whale appeared no bigger than a sprat, through some no bigger than a vinegar eel, and through their ordinary ones an elephant seemed no bigger than a flea, a camel no bigger than a louse, and an ostrich no bigger than a mite. To relate all their optic observations through the several sorts of their glasses would be a tedious work, and tire even the most patient reader, wherefore I'll pass them by. Only this was very remarkable and worthy to be taken notice of, that notwithstanding their great skill, industry, and ingenuity in experimental philosophy, they could yet by no means contrive such glasses by the help of which they could spy out a vacuum with all its dimensions, nor immaterial substances, non-beings, and mixed beings, or such as are between something and nothing, which they were very much troubled at, hoping that yet in time, by long study and practice, they might perhaps attain to it. Stay tuned for the next section of The Blazing World by the Duchess of Newcastle. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg and LibriVox for helping me find many interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.